All right. Well, we are moving right along with the course. We're getting near to the end. We have, I think, two more chapters, two more videos here. Stress and aging is next up on the list. So, what do we want to talk about with stress? Is aging stressful? Well, we've covered some of that. But what I think we want to talk about here is some of the unique aspects related to stress that older adults face. Couple of things right off the bat. The first is the issue of the accumulated effect of chronic stress. It's sort of a truism, right? Everyone knows the stress is bad for us, um, but in particular, chronic stress is bad for us. And chronic stress is not something that is particularly unique to any certain age group, right? Chronic stress can start to occur at maybe any point in life. But the relevance to an aging course is that the longer one experiences chronic stress, the more those negative effects will accumulate. And then, of course, as we get older, and as we age through our adulthood years, and if we are experiencing chronic sources of stress all along the way, then the degree to which we have some accumulated health effects is going to be a little harder on us the older we get, right? So being concerned about these long-term health effects is something that is called psychoneuroimmunology. So yeah, I know that's a mouthful, but what we're going to see, and I have this little more detail in the next slide or two slides away down here, that stress has, by the way, this word, it has its origins in the biopsychosocial model, which I know we talked about when it came to mental health and health in general. So we know that stress has psychological effects on us. We also know it has effects on the brain, but it also has effects on the immune system, and that might be the surprising part of it. And so, how all of these things work together, right? Psychological and biological effects here, and even there's a social component as well, which we will see when we talk about coping with stress. Uh, that's all going to kind of come together here. Now, what's a broad way to talk about the effect of stress here? I have right here the idea of allostatic load. So, what's going on here? Recall back to say intro psych and physio psych and any other relevant course you may have had about the autonomic nervous system and the balance between the sympathetic system versus the parasympathetic system. You might remember the idea of the parasympathetic being the rest and digest system and the sympathetic being the fight or flight response. Well, it's not just the fight or flight response, right? But rather there's a kind of a balance between these two systems. And anytime we experience any sort of arousal, that means the balance is shifting towards the sympathetic side of this equation. And of course, stress is going to do that. It doesn't necessarily jump all the way to the extreme of that, high intensity arousal of the fight or flight, but it can still shift the balance in that direction. And that's going to activate those systems that are normally part of the sympathetic activation. So that does mean, right, when we think of fight or flight, what do we think? We think of like increasing cardiovascular output, right? One of the major themes is that we want to increase energy for muscle contraction so that in a literal fight or flight situation that we can run or fight or do any of those physical things we need to do at with maximum amount of energy support for that. So that means we're going to increase heart rate. We're going to increase blood pressure. That's going to increase the flow of blood through the body. We're going to increase respiration to get more oxygen into the blood as well. We also need energy in the form of glucose to support muscle contraction. And that means digestion? No, because that's a slow process and that's regulated by it's the counterpart parasympathetic nervous system. So we're going to have the liver produce glucose, right? We're going to have it dump glucose, converting glycogen into glucose into the bloodstream here. And that's going to cause our blood sugar to spike. But the idea, of course, is that normally that's going to get used up in some fight or flight muscle contraction sort of situation. But what happens when we're experiencing chronic stress? And even though it doesn't go to that extreme, we still have a slight elevation in the heart rate and blood pressure and respiration. We still have a slight increase in blood sugar levels, in increased load on the liver as a result of that. So all of that means that these systems are being taxed, right? They're being loaded. And that puts a bit of a wear and tear on all of these systems and just the overall regulatory system in general. Because likewise, since we are shutting down the parasympathetic rest and digest, that means that a lot of the other stuff is being inhibited here, like the digestion itself and the digestive system. Reproductive hormones and sex hormones are also suppressed here. Systems in the brain that are not critical for immediate perception and attention to the external environment, like memory encoding, which is a very energetically intensive part of brain function, are being suppressed. Growth hormone is also being suppressed. So, and of course, the immune system is also being suppressed here because all of these are very metabolically intensive activities that are not critical during a stress situation. So this kind of shift over towards prolonged sympathetic activation and putting more wear and tear on all of these various systems that are being either overexcited or maybe chronically suppressed causes these long-term health problems, right? Of course, something else that it does is it means that over time, our ability to recover from a stressful episode may be prolonged because the body takes a little bit longer to kind of reset itself. But again, these downstream concerns from chronic stress are also a major thing that we want to consider here. Another factor relevant for aging is the idea of stress proliferation. So again, this can happen at any age. And the idea refers to the fact that you have one stressful event, a stressor, and then sometimes this causes a cascade where lots of other things go wrong as well, and that causes then multiple what we would call secondary stressors. One example right here on the slide, right? So you have a health event, that is some kind of major health concern occurs. Of course, that's going to cause stress in and of itself, so that'll be our primary stressor. But then we might have medical bills. We might lose work and therefore lose income. So now we have financial strain. Now, this might cause strain on our relationships. It might cause strain on our partner who has to become a caregiver for some degree, or maybe the partner has to miss work to come attend to us in the hospital and do various other things, and they have increased responsibilities. So again, relationship stress. Changes in the roles now, in the role dynamics, right? We've talked about that caregiver role dynamic, and so that, again, causes a little bit of conflict. And maybe certain changes to your ability as a result of this might affect your identity, and we've talked about identity assimilation and accommodation. So now these are all become multiple secondary stressors. Of course, these can happen to us at any age, as I said, but what I also have noted here is that there are some unique stressors in late life that can have a big impact on our risk for this kind of proliferating series of stressors, right? So we talk about bereavement. So, of course, that can happen at any age, but as I noted in a previous lecture, the older we get, the more likely it is that we will start to outlive other people that we've been close to for our whole lives. So we go through more of these kind of situations, over the years. And especially as we get older, the frequency of this may begin to increase. We've also previously talked about role exit. And so the idea of retirement and what retirement does in terms of changing our social role, even affecting our identity to the extent that your career was a big part of your identity. That's, again, going to impact stress in late life here. There's also the possibility known as anticipatory stress. So the idea is that we might begin to worry about things a little bit more. So if you're older and you're not necessarily experiencing any significant changes to your health or your ability, but you know it can happen, right? And so that might cause you to start to develop some sense of worry, or you might worry about income now that you're approaching retirement and you're worried about your future income. Again, we're anticipating these negative things that may happen in the future. That's important really to think about is when we think about stress, we usually talk about something has happened, right? And so you go through your primary appraisal, which is you're aware that it has happened, and then your secondary appraisal is related to how much you feel that you can cope and deal with that source of stress. But oftentimes we are stressed about things that haven't actually happened yet, right? So the primary appraisal is something relevant to the future here that I anticipate the possibility of these things happening. And so there may be more things to worry about for that older adults will have to face. Again, with the caregiver burden and financial stress on this list as well. So again, many more reasons for people to experience potentially unique stressors and therefore unique proliferations or cascades of stress as in later years. Now, on this issue of social support, this part of the biopsychosocial business, let me talk about this resource convoy. So there's many different factors relevant to how we cope with stress, but one of them is called the stress buffering hypothesis of social support. So let me say that again, the stress buffering hypothesis of social support. So what this means is that oftentimes we use a certain network of close relationships to help us cope with stress. So if you've ever like sat around with your friends and you have commiserated with them about the problems and you're experiencing, and maybe you all share your own kind of experiences and you sympathize with each other and everyone offers their advice and their opinions and their feedback and so forth, it helps, right? They don't necessarily always solve your problems, but just being able to talk to people and having that kind of support, social and emotional support, it really is known to impact our coping success here, right? So now what's happening is that social network that we have can get smaller as we get older. So we might be losing that. But there may be other restrictions that we're facing that are part of our ways that we would normally cope with stress. And so because of a decline in all of these resources, whether it's financial incomes or financial related resources, or whether it's physical ability or social network, all of that together are part of all of the many resources we have at our disposal to cope with problems as we face them. And that's called the resource convoy, right? This is all of this whole bundle of things that we carry with us in life that helps us cope and deal with problems when we face them. Now, the resource convoy is going to start to shrink. It's going to start to decrease. And that means the pool of resources that we can pull from to cope with problems is going to decline, right? So that's an important consideration. So here's the psychoneuroimmunology. What are the long-term impacts of chronic stress? So let's talk about the hormone cortisol. This is part of the sympathetic nervous system's response during arousal. It has a lot of jobs. It raises cardiovascular output and it causes the liver to produce more glucose. It also has an effect on the brain. It stimulates the amygdala and some other limbic regions of the brain so that we experience those emotional effects associated with stress. But it is as a corticosteroid hormone, that is, it's a steroid hormone produced in the cortex of the adrenal glands. It has properties that are very similar to corticosteroid medications that people might take, say prednisone, for example. Many of these hormone medications are taken because they are anti-inflammatory. So if someone is experiencing a lot of inflammatory processes for whatever reason, you take steroid hormones to treat that. Cortisol naturally has these same anti-inflammatory properties, right? So one of the things they do is that it disrupts the production of cytokines. And cytokines, I always never decide how to say it. These are essentially chemical messengers that the immune system uses to target the source of an infection. So the T cells and the B cells, NK cells, these are the actual antibodies that fight off an infection. But the cytokines are the ones that help those cells locate and find the source of an infection. So with a disruption of the cytokinetic signaling, that means that in the presence of an infection, all of the antibodies don't necessarily get there efficiently, and that causes delayed healing, right? That means that you're just going to have an increased risk of either getting an infection or prolonged healing from the infection. Meanwhile, in the presence of that infection, the immune system might actually make more T cells or B cells to go fight it off, but they're not really targeting the infection efficiently. So now they're just kind of roaming around the body looking for something else to do. And this is where we might start to run into issues related to autoimmune disorders as well. So what's happening here is that because of this dysregulation of the immune system, not only do we have this susceptibility, the suppressed immune system, and prolonged healing, but now these extraneous antibodies can start to attack other body systems. For some people who have already been diagnosed with what's called an autoimmune disorder, this means a flare-up of that disorder. So what is an autoimmune disorder? This is when your immune system, rather than just attacking something that's not supposed to be there, like a bacteria or a virus, it instead attacks your own body systems. Normally, there are markers on these antibody cells that help them tell the difference between your own body versus something else that's not supposed to be in there. But this can break down, and that's what happens with autoimmune disorders. And so when someone has something like, say, multiple sclerosis, the immune system starts to attack the myelin sheath of neurons, right? And that starts to impact the nervous system. Or with rheumatoid arthritis, it starts to attack the connective tissues in your joints, causing joint inflammation, swelling, and pain. With systemic lupus, it attacks a variety of other connective tissues in the body. And there's a long list of autoimmune disorders. Crohn's disease now attacking the lining of the GI tract, right? So these can all now flare up and trigger as a result of stress, because now you're going to have this extra immune function that's just kind of roaming around the body, not targeting the actual source of some, say, inflammation. It remains, I don't want to overstate the issue a little bit and suggest that stress could actually be one of the causal factors in the emergence and etiology of an autoimmune disorder, but certainly that can't be ruled out as well. One of the other things that cortisol does here is that it impacts the blood-brain barrier. So another thing from PhysioPsych here is we don't want blood directly in contact with neurons. And so the glial cells, specifically astrocytes, provide the blood-brain barrier. What they do is they wrap themselves around blood vessels that feed the brain, extract the nutrients, and then transfer those nutrients to the neurons. As this weakens, and it does weaken as we get older, and that's one of the key factors that relates to some of the neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease. What's happening is that in addition to the red blood cells, we also have the white blood cells, the antibodies, and they can get in there and they can start to, they don't necessarily recognize the neurons, and so they start to damage neurons, and this then results in the formation of the plaques and tangles associated with Alzheimer's disease. Cortisol weakens this as well, so the idea is that separate from just an age-related influence on the blood-brain barrier, we can have a chronic stress implication here as well. And that would then suggest that might we start to claim that a disease like Alzheimer's disease has something of an autoimmune component to it? And the answer is yeah. There's a ton of research emerging in recent years looking at this exact same issue, right? And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that the arterial plaques associated with atherosclerosis are also inflammatory in nature. And there are immune cells found embedded within those arterial plaques. And it might be the case to say that just like with Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease may have an autoimmune component to it. And could that also be caused by chronic stress? Yes, of course. So again, stress is pretty bad, right? Okay, what else are we going to go on here? Glutathione. So what is glutathione? It's an antioxidant. So if you've ever heard someone say we should have a antioxidant-rich diet, usually a Mediterranean diet, what's crucial here for this class is that the Mediterranean diet has frequently been labeled an anti-aging diet. And that's because antioxidants are good at preventing oxidative stress. What is oxidative stress? Well, oxidation, this is what happens when iron rusts, for example, right? So atoms in the iron start to lose electrons, right? And it corrodes and it degrades. Well, the cells in our body made of atoms can also start to lose those electrons, and that means those tissues begin to degrade and decline. And this can be accelerated by things that are called free radicals, and these are the things that are damaging those atoms and causing this oxidation of your cells. And this can cause genetic damage, right? So some of the actual, molecular sequences in DNA are at risk to this kind of oxidative stress. And that kind of genetic damage can increase our risk of cancer. And on top of that, we've already learned about telomere shortening with aging, and so oxidative stress can also accelerate telomere shortening and therefore accelerate age-related changes as well. Now, glutathione is manufactured in the body as an antioxidant that helps to fight off free radicals. Of course, this can be assisted by a diet that is rich in antioxidants, but cortisol inhibits glutathione, so therefore it's going to increase the effects of free radicals, and therefore increases our risk of cancer and increases and accelerates aging effects. So again, stress, not good. Other stress hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, these play a much more critical central role in increasing cardiovascular output. So the idea is chronic stress means increased hypertension, right? Increased blood pressure over long periods of time. That's what hypertension is. It's also making the heart work a little bit harder. So that means that we can have some weakening of the heart, and this is called left ventricular atrophy. So in this case, what's happening is the left ventricle of the brain is ending up a little bit weaker, and this can be associated with congestive heart failure. There's also a hypertrophy that can occur in the heart as well. This causes some other parts of the heart to get a thicker walls to make up for that, and because they're working so hard, it's a muscle after all, and it will get thicker. And that also is increasing our risk for certain arrhythmias and so forth. And as I mentioned, the vascular inflammation means that the inflammation of the lining of the arteries causes damage to the lining of the arteries, and then this causes a place for stuff to accumulate, like dead cells and antibodies and various other things, and that then results in the formation of the atherosclerotic plaques of cardiovascular disease. So we want to minimize that kind of vascular inflammation, and that by doing that, means we want to minimize epinephrine and norepinephrine levels when we can, which means minimizing stress, of course. Okay, so we painted a picture that stress is bad for us, and older adults may have some unique risks here. But that said, we also have a little paradox of sorts to take a look at. And this is the idea that older adults report oftentimes lower levels of stress subjectively, right? Despite the fact that there's all this other stuff that can happen, right? And well, we can explain this a little bit, right? So we've talked about before the socio-emotional selectivity theory, and this is the idea of placing greater emphasis on emotionally significant events, especially those that are associated with positive emotional reactions. So that means emotional states are improving as we get older in many cases, and that's just going to help us feel a little more resilient and less stressed. Also worth pointing out is an idea related to wisdom and post-formal thinking. So if you recall on that chapter on post-formal thinking, we explored the idea of becoming an expert at life, and part of that means developing better strategies for coping with problems, and feeling a little more comfortable, especially sometimes with the complexity and the ambiguity of difficult life problems. And because we've developed a lifetime of good strategies for dealing with that, it's as if we've become inoculated against them, right? That now that I'm facing a new stressor, I'm essentially inoculated by being able to think, this again. I know how to handle this, right? Maybe 20 years ago, I would not have known how to handle that, and it would have caused me stress, but I've become better at this. I've become a little bit of an expert, right? So that's one way to possibly explain that even though this increased risk of proliferation is a concern for aging. The gains in life expertise can potentially offset that and maybe even take us in the other direction to make things better, right? But on the topic of coping, we do want to address a few specifics here. May have talked about continuity theory before, right? So continuity theory is a broad theory of lifespan development that says exactly as I have it here, that people want a sense of continuity across their entire lifespan, right? I want to feel that I'm the same person now that I was 20 years ago, and I should hope that in another 20 years' time, I still feel like I am me, right? I'm the same person. I have the same abilities, the same personality, the same values, and so on and so forth, right? I'm still me. And that means that my self-concept, my personality, my preferences, the way in which I connect to other people and the friendships that I have and the place where I live, these are all part of me. And that includes my coping styles, right? The fact that I might want to listen to a certain kind of music or do a certain kind of thing because that's just who I am when I want to relax, and that's what I do, right? This is all part of what continuity theory is telling us here. But that aside, of course, having that sense of continuity is great, but continuity doesn't always help, and that's the concern. So let's think about this here. What I have under coping styles is that when we are young, we first started encountering stressors. It's very typical that we might start to encounter regular stressors in our adolescence and early adulthood years. Usually those stressors are relatively mild and transient, though. But we will start to develop coping strategies that work for those mild or transient sorts of things. Oftentimes it's called a problem-focused coping style, right? So there's different coping styles. There's problem-focused, where I'm going to tackle the problem and solve it. There's emotion-focused, where I'm going to try to regulate my emotional reaction. Social coping, I mentioned already earlier in this video about the stress buffering hypothesis of social support. And there's even defensive coping. I don't think I put this, it's on the bottom here. Defensive coping is when we kind of ignore our problems, right? And try to distract ourselves and so forth. But when we're young, we tend to adopt a problem-focused style. One of the main reasons for that is it can be a very effective coping style because it solves the problem and makes it go away. And therefore, if you've solved it and made it go away, it's no longer going to be something that causes you stress. And when we are faced with problems that are something we can solve, like if you're a college student, you might have stressors associated with an upcoming test. One way to make that go away is to just study a little harder, right? So that's a problem-focused approach to that. But there's not necessarily certain things we can do with problem-focused approaches once we get older and we start dealing with some of those significant things that I mentioned on the first slide, like say bereavement, for example. That's not a problem you can solve per se, right? You don't have much control over these kinds of situations. So the idea is that continuity theory is going to suggest that I develop this coping style and I'm going to try to stick with it, but I'm going to find that it maybe is not as adaptive as it used to be. So now that my coping styles that I used to use don't work as well as they used to, all right? We know that social coping works very well in terms of that it's part of the emotion-focused side of things. But again, based on this idea of the resource convoy decline, then that means that also is going to be less effective as well. Emotion focused is helpful, right? So finding more personal ways to manage your own emotional states, finding ways to relax and so forth. These are all important ways that can still succeed, as is meaning focused coping. So what is that? This is what happens when people find meaning in their suffering. So you're going through something very difficult in life, but if you can sort of find meaning in it. This comes from like the research of Viktor Frankl, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he helped develop a therapy called logotherapy, where people try to determine the meaning of their lives, and therefore this helps them see meaning in various stresses and problems and tragedies that they experience in their life. These can all be extremely helpful, very, very positive and helpful ways of dealing with major problems. But as noted here, they're pretty challenging, right? Sometimes it can be very hard in the middle of some terrible event to try to find a way to just relax and listen to music or something, or to find meaning in it. Sometimes it's hard to really make yourself think that way. So, but as noted, socio-emotional selectivity theory is going to help us out here a little bit, right? So that's part of this stress paradox, is that to the extent that many older adults are much more likely to tune in to the positive emotional sides of things, then that's going to help out quite a bit here. Another one that could also be interesting here is proactive coping. So, talking about the worrying business, right? Well, one of the things that we can do is that if I am worried about something happening in the future, that could cause me some stress. But something else that I can do is that if I'm proactively worrying, I can proactively cope, meaning I can anticipate a problem before it happens, and then I can try to do something to either prevent that from happening or minimize its impact if it does happen. And again, this is the kind of thing that we might start to associate with that life expertise, wisdom, post-formal thinking kind of business. I think it kind of makes a lot of sense there to say that that's part of being an expert at life is anticipating problems before they happen so that you can ward that off in some way or another. As noted, defensive coping or avoidant coping is something that can also be something we observe here, but it's not particularly helpful, right? Ignoring your problems, it might be easy to distract yourself by, immersing yourself in some kind of activity, binge watching TV or whatever it might be, or just doom scrolling online, right? But these don't really work, right? So to the extent that during that time that you're distracted, it might be for a few hours at a time, you might be able to distract yourself from whatever is causing you problems, and that's fine. But as soon as you're done with that activity, the problem is still there, and the knowledge of it is still there, and the emotions associated with it are still there, and you haven't solved the problem, and you haven't figured out what to do with your emotions or any of these issues. So this is a very short term kind of a thing. It doesn't really result in the best possible outcome here. So that's our take home lesson. I do believe that's the last slide. That is, in fact, the last slide. So we'll go ahead and call it here. And stay tuned for the next video, which will be the last one for the course.